Hello and welcome to our channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most chilling stories of our time, an exploration into the twisted mind of Alexander Pichushkin, the chessboard killer. If you're fascinated by the darkest corners of the human psyche, you've come to the right place. Pichushkin's obsession with filling a chessboard with the lives he claimed is a tale that blurs the lines between strategy, madness, and horror. Before we begin this harrowing journey, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more content that unearths the stories lurking in the shadows. Now, let's step into the mind of a killer, if you dare. Alexander Pichushkin was born on April 9, 1974, in Mitishi, a small, unremarkable town just outside Moscow. To the untrained eye, his childhood seemed ordinary, even unremarkable. Yet beneath the surface, a dark and disturbing story was already beginning to unfold, a story that would eventually earn Pichushkin the nickname, the Chessboard Killer. From the start, Pichushkin's life was marked by isolation. His father abandoned the family when Alexander was still an infant, leaving his mother, Natalia, to raise him alone. The absence of a father figure left a void in young Alexander's life, one that he would struggle to fill with increasingly destructive behavior. A turning point came when Pichushkin was just 4 years old. He was playing on a swing when a child's innocent play turned deadly. A hard fall from the swing resulted in a severe head injury, one that doctors would later believe caused damage to his frontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, aggression, and decision-making. It was as though the injury had unlocked something deep and malevolent within him, something that would grow and fester over the years. Pichushkin's early school years were marked by difficulty. He struggled academically, often falling behind his peers. This, combined with a growing sense of alienation, made him an easy target for bullies. He was relentlessly teased and tormented, which only deepened his resentment and anger. By the time he reached adolescence, these feelings of inadequacy and rage had become a boiling cauldron, ready to overflow. But there was one area where Pichushkin excelled: chess. His grandfather, who recognized the boy's potential, introduced him to the game. Chess became an escape for Alexander, a world where his intelligence and strategic thinking could shine. The board offered him something real life did not: control. Each move was deliberate, calculated, and methodical, mirroring the approach Pichushkin would later take in his deadly endeavors. As Pichushkin entered his teenage years, the violence inside him began to surface. He had grown into a brooding young man, quiet but with a simmering intensity that made others uneasy. His grandfather, the one person who seemed to understand him, passed away when Pichushkin was 18. This loss devastated him, severing the last connection to normalcy in his life. Bereft and alone, Pichushkin turned to alcohol to numb his pain. He began frequenting Moscow's Bitsa Park, a sprawling, gloomy expanse that would later become his hunting ground. It was here, amidst the shadows of the trees and the secluded paths, that his fascination with death began to take hold. His first attempt at murder came in 1992, not long after his grandfather's death. Pichushkin invited a fellow student, Mikhail Odachuk, to join him in the park for a drink. As they walked through the darkened woods, Pichushkin's mind raced with thoughts of violence. He intended to kill Mikhail, but something held him back at the last moment. Whether it was fear, uncertainty, or simply the realization that he was not yet ready, Pichushkin allowed Mikhail to leave the park alive. It would be almost a decade before he attempted murder again, but this time, there would be no hesitation. By 2001, Alexander Pichushkin had reached a breaking point. The anger and resentment that had festered within him for years could no longer be contained. He was ready to kill, and he had a plan. Pichushkin's first victim was Mikhail, a friend from his chess-playing days. Under the guise of friendship, he lured Mikhail to Bitsa Park, offering him a drink as they sat in the eerie quiet of the park. But the atmosphere was tense, charged with an unspoken danger that only Pichushkin understood. As Mikhail took a sip of vodka, Pichushkin reached into his bag, pulling out a blunt object, a hammer. Before Mikhail could react, Pichushkin struck him on the head, the force of the blow instantly shattering his skull. The crack of bone echoed through the trees, but there was no one to hear. Pichushkin stared down at the lifeless body, his heart racing, not with fear, but with exhilaration. The game had begun. Over the next 5 years, Pichushkin would kill with increasing frequency. His victims were often those society overlooked, homeless men, alcoholics, and the elderly. They were easy prey, individuals whose disappearances were unlikely to raise alarm. Pichushkin was meticulous in his approach. He would invite his victims to drink with him in Bitsa Park, using vodka to lower their guard. Once they were sufficiently intoxicated, he would strike, bludgeoning them to death with his hammer. After the murder, he would often push their bodies into the sewer wells scattered throughout the park, ensuring they would never be found. Each murder brought Pichushkin a sense of power and control that he had never experienced before. He saw himself as a god, a force of death and destruction, capable of snuffing out life with a single blow. But it wasn't just the act of killing that thrilled him, it was the meticulous planning, the strategy, the careful execution. In his mind, each murder was like a move on a chessboard, part of a larger game that only he could win. As Pichushkin's killing spree continued, he began to develop a twisted goal, to fill all 64 squares of a chessboard with the names of his victims. Each murder was represented by a square on the board, a symbol of his progress in the game. By the time he was caught, Pichushkin had killed at least 61 people, though he later claimed the number was higher. He was just 3 squares short of completing his gruesome chessboard. Pichushkin's obsession with chess was no coincidence. The game had been a part of his life since childhood, a way to assert control in a world where he felt powerless. But as his mind darkened, so too did his relationship with the game. Chess became more than just a pastime, it became a symbol of his need to dominate, to outmaneuver, to win at any cost. In his later confessions, Pichushkin spoke of the joy he felt in killing, comparing it to the rush of making a successful chess move. "Life without murder," he said, "is like a life for you without food." His need to kill was insatiable, a hunger that could never be fully satisfied. He described the act of murder as a drug, one that gave him a sense of euphoria and power that nothing else could. But even as he reveled in his killings, Pichushkin knew that his game couldn't last forever. The police were beginning to take notice of the growing number of disappearances in Bitsa Park. It was only a matter of time before his luck ran out. The end came on March 15, 2006, when Pichushkin made a fatal mistake. Marina Moskolyova, a 36-year-old woman, had agreed to meet him for a drink in Bitsa Park. But unlike his previous victims, Marina was not a homeless person or an elderly man. She was a mother, a woman with a family who would notice if she disappeared. As they walked through the park, Pichushkin followed his usual routine, offering Marina vodka and waiting for her to become intoxicated. But Marina was cautious. She had left a note for her son, detailing her plans to meet Pichushkin and even giving his phone number. When she didn't return home that night, her son contacted the police, leading them straight to Pichushkin. When Pichushkin was arrested on June 16, 2006, he did not resist. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. During his interrogation, he confessed to 61 murders with chilling detachment. He described each killing in detail, his voice devoid of emotion. For Pichushkin, the game was over, and he had lost. The trial of Alexander Pichushkin began in September 2007 and quickly became one of the most sensational cases in Russian history. The media dubbed him the Chessboard Killer, a name that captured both his obsession with the game and the cold, calculated nature of his crimes. In court, Pichushkin showed no remorse. He sat calmly, often smiling as he listened to the testimony of witnesses and the accounts of his murders. He seemed to take pride in his actions, reveling in the attention and the fear he inspired. When asked if he regretted anything, he replied simply, "My only regret is that I did not reach the last square on the chessboard." Psychologists who examined Pichushkin diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, characterized by a lack of empathy, a disregard for the rights of others, and a tendency toward violence. But Pichushkin's condition went beyond mere pathology. He was a true psychopath, driven by a need for power and control that knew no bounds. To him, his victims were nothing more than pieces in a game, pawns to be sacrificed in his pursuit of victory. The trial lasted just over a month, and on October 29, 2007, Pichushkin was found guilty of 49 murders and 3 attempted murders. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the first 15 years to be spent in solitary confinement. The courtroom was tense as the verdict was read, the silence only broken by the collective exhale of those who had followed the case with morbid fascination. Pichushkin showed no reaction as the sentence was handed down. His expression remained stoic, almost indifferent, as though the trial was nothing more than an inconvenience, a mere formality in a game he had already mentally checked out of. His lack of remorse was chilling, even in the face of judgment. He displayed no signs of guilt, no understanding of the horror he had wrought. Psychologists and criminologists who studied Pichushkin's case have tried to understand what could drive a person to commit such heinous acts. Pichushkin's behavior suggested a deep-rooted psychopathy, characterized by a complete lack of empathy and an insatiable desire for control. But there was something more, an almost obsessive need to be recognized, to be feared. In interviews and psychological evaluations, Pichushkin spoke of his murders with a disturbing calmness. He referred to his victims not as people, but as objects, dehumanizing them in a way that allowed him to kill without remorse. He described the act of murder as the ultimate satisfaction, a feeling that was beyond anything he could experience in normal life. Pichushkin's obsession with the chessboard, his goal of filling all 64 squares with victims, was reflection of his need for order and control in a life that had been marked by chaos and instability. The chessboard became a metaphor for his world, each move a calculated step toward his ultimate goal. In his mind, the murders were not crimes, but achievements, milestones in his twisted journey. Behind every one of Pichushkin's murders was a life that was tragically cut short. His victims, often the vulnerable and forgotten members of society, were chosen for their perceived weakness, but each had a story. One such victim was 63-year-old Nikolai Zakharov, a homeless man who had fallen on hard times. Nikolai had once been a respected factory worker, but after losing his job and his family, he turned to alcohol. It was this vulnerability that Pichushkin exploited, offering Nikolai a drink and the false promise of friendship. Nikolai's body was later found in a sewer well, his skull shattered by Pichushkin's hammer. Another victim was 45-year-old Lyudmila Koropanova, a mother of 2 children who had been struggling with alcoholism. Lyudmila was lured to Bitsa Park by Pichushkin, who promised her companionship in exchange for a drink. Her body was found months later, decomposed and forgotten, like so many of Pichushkin's other victims. Then there was Marina Moskolyova, the woman whose death ultimately led to Pichushkin's capture. Marina was a mother and a daughter, loved by her family and friends. Her tragic end at Pichushkin's hands was a stark reminder of the indiscriminate nature of his violence. Unlike his other victims, Marina's death did not go unnoticed, and it was her foresight in leaving a note that finally brought the chessboard killer to justice. Alexander Pichushkin's story does not have a neat conclusion. The chessboard remains incomplete, the final squares forever unfilled. But perhaps that is fitting. For a man like Pichushkin, there could never be true closure, only the endless, gnawing desire for more. He is a monster who will never be satisfied, a killer who will never stop dreaming of his next move, even as the world around him closes in. In the end, Pichushkin's game is a reminder that evil is not always a sudden explosion of violence, but can be something far more insidious, a slow, methodical descent into madness, driven by a need for power and control that can never be quenched. And as long as that need exists, so too does the danger it represents, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next chance to strike. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey into the mind of Alexander Pichushkin, the chessboard killer. We hope this deep dive into his twisted world has left you with more questions than answers, as we continue to explore the darkest corners of humanity. If you found this story as unsettling as we did, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover more tales that haunt the night and bring them to light. And remember, the shadows always have more to tell, so stay tuned for our next story.